Bonjour à vous tous, bonjour à vous toutes. Je suis très fier d'être ici, très heureux d'être avec vous. Pour ceux et celles qui n'ont pas eu l'occasion de visiter la ville de Gatineau, c'est juste l'autre côté de la rivière, donc c'est pas très loin et c'est très très beau. Mais je ne ferai pas de comparaison entre les deux côtés de la rivière par politesse pour nos hôtes d'aujourd'hui. I'm delighted to be here with you, and I want to start by thanking our speakers today. Some of them made a very long trip to be with us, so thank you very much for being here. The title of our plenary today is Cities and Migration. We are looking to explore and discuss the critical role of municipalities and local civil society in the successful inclusion of newcomers. Je vais coordonner la discussion. Je vais essayer de parler très, très peu, même si comme maire, je ne suis pas très habitué à peu parler. I'll try to be, but I'm allowed to give you a brief glimpse of Gatineau, our context, and why this discussion is so interesting to me. Gatineau is the fourth largest city in Quebec, the 18th largest in Canada, with roughly 300,000 citizens. Gatineau takes in the second largest number of immigrants in Quebec after Greater Montreal, so more than actually 12% of our residents are of recent immigrant origins. I believe it's essential that municipalities be involved in these discussions about immigration because when immigrants settle somewhere, I profoundly believe that they do not settle in Canada, they do not settle in Quebec, they settle in cities, even in neighborhoods. The challenges of immigration are met first and foremost at the local level. Quand l'immigration se passe mal, quand il y a des difficultés, c'est le téléphone du maire qui sonne en premier. C'est vraiment au niveau local où on peut constater les difficultés ou ce qui se passe bien. Là, chez nous, ça se passe assez bien, mais c'est au niveau local où on constate sur le terrain vraiment la réalité, le succès ou l'échec de l'immigration. Et vos travaux dans ce sens-là sont extrêmement importants pour équiper les autorités locales pour faire face à ces défis-là. As far as I'm concerned, climate changes and immigration are the two biggest challenges of our time, and they're all met at the local level. Je suis entouré de nos panélistes. On a à ma droite Madame Anna Visvisi, Chair and President at the Research and Innovation Institute. Toujours à ma droite, Monsieur John G. Bongat, Mayor of Naga in the Philippines. Then Madame Colleen Tuez, Director of the Welcoming and Integrated Societies Division at the Open Society Foundations in New York. I should have said Dr. Colleen Tuez. And then Ms. Debbie Douglas, Executive Director of the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, better known as OCASI. And Dr. Gioconda Herrera, Sociology Professor at the Latin American Faculty of Social Science in Quito. They will all have, they will each have 12 minutes to share their thoughts regarding our subjects. As we have 5 speakers and we would like to keep some time to discuss and take questions, I will unfortunately have to be very strict on the timing. So it's 12 minutes each, and then I get very, very nervous. So without further introduction, we will get started. I would invite Dr. Visvisi to the podium for a presentation. Unless you want to stay, please stay, I'll sit beside you.
Also do without slides. Can you hear me? Can they hear me? No. No? That's what they do? Technology.
Okay, yeah, you can speak a little louder.
Yes, so now can you hear me? Yes, does it work? No, it doesn't. No? Can we have some assistance, please? I don't know if it works.
You have to closer to the mic.
Yeah. Yes, the mic? It is, right? Yeah. All right, now it is, all right. All right, that's fine. Good morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. It's a privilege and an honor to have been invited and to speak to such a distinguished audience. The last 4 days during this conference have been of immense value because this is a very rare encounter of experts, practitioners, and academics all involved in the field of migration. So without any further ado, let me just introduce you to the brief topic, that I'm going to discuss, which is smart cities and migration. There were some slides, but they're irrelevant at this point. So yesterday we were talking about migration and technology and the connection between these two. In particular, we looked at this macro dimension of the connection, looking at how migrants are accounted for, identified, and how the admission process proceeds. In this context, we talk about biometrics, etc. But there was also a very interesting discussion on what's the role of social media in portraying or accounting for migration. And the hint was that, well, unfortunately, because of the accessibility of social media and in an era that everyone can be editor of news, migration has been instrumentalized to the disadvantage of those who would very much need our support. So the purpose of my presentation today is to have a slightly different view on the issue. So I'm going to look at the connection between cities and more particular smart cities and migration. So everyone knows that smart cities as such is a hot topic, not less is migration, but surprisingly the connection between these two, that is smart cities and migration, remains relatively under-discussed. So in my discussion, which will consist of just additional 4 steps, I'm going to highlight the connection and see what is there in there for us as policymakers, academics, or also civil society members. So clearly, we all know that the preponderant part of migrants globally, be it in the global north or south, they basically flock in cities. So depending on the specific case, but it's about 60 up to 80% of all migrants, they go to the cities because cities offer the imagined opportunities, or real at times as well. So this suggests that the pressures are basically located in the city and urban space. If current trends continue, then by the year 2050, the number of migrants globally will be close to 500 million. So if we just try to connect the dots, the connection between migration and cities is one of the most important ones. So in short, cities rather than national authorities are the ones who bear the burden and the challenge of addressing and mitigating challenges and possibly opportunities that migration inflicts. So I would like to look at this issue from 3 perspectives. First, when you look at the city space and what the city authorities have to do, you definitely deal with the issue of management of regular and irregular entries. So this is very much a legal dimension where you need to have a very good collaboration between the national level authorities and local city authorities. But there is also a very important issue related to space scarcity and resource scarcity. So we cannot make cities expand in several cases. So the question is how the authorities deal with it. Then we have the resultant challenges such as health and sanitation, epidemics, shelter, safety, integration of the incoming population. But we cannot forget also about the receiving population, considering that we have several constraints. So what is the second perspective I would like to emphasize? Well, cities lack resources. Cities lack the necessary support from national governments, frequently, again, cities develop their expertise ad hoc. Very rarely we have cities that develop resilience strategies, but there are several very good examples that cities actually do it. So as a result, migration is not necessarily a factor that is included in resilience strategies if they are developed in the first place. And the third point that I would like to emphasize is that the role of cities in the global value chain is bound to increase, and therefore in the years to come it will be cities rather than national economies that will be competing with each other. So if you try to put these points A, B, and C together, then clearly we cannot deny that the connection between cities and migration is one of the most important ones that we should be looking at these days. So the point number 3 of my discussion is, so what is the connection between smart city and migration? So as you well know, the key focus point of the discussion on smart cities is how and to what extent sophisticated information and communication technology can facilitate the functioning of a city space in terms of a city's ability to withstand, preempt, or address challenges and risks and threats as they emerge. So seen in this way, smart cities research essentially deals with questions such as governance, mobility, economy, including new forms of economic collaboration, energy, living conditions, including also architecture and architectural design. Finally, there's also the issue of environment. So seen in this way, smart cities research, and increasingly so also smart city-oriented policy making, is very much related to these spheres. So the big question is, what is the value added of smart cities, seen in this way, and in particular the value added of ICT, when cities encounter the challenge of migration? So what is the promise that ICT holds? And I still have 5 minutes, so I'm just fine. So migrants, as we all know, as they first arrive, and let's say the city of Athens, where I'm based, is one of the very illustrative examples. They need to have shelter. We need to make sure that their health is also considered. There is the big issue of epidemics, the question of sanitation, safety, access to information, communication. We also need to make sure that they are physically well and that the psychology is also up, because otherwise what can happen? So many people talk about integration, but I think the big question really is, how do we make sure that the migrants, as they arrive, they actually are given a degree of normalcy so that they can look forward with a hope? So now, what about smart cities in this context? We already said, well, pretty much it is about the encounter of ICT and such processes and issues as governance, mobility, economy, energy, living conditions, architecture, and environment. So in which ways ICT can be useful to facilitate the transition of migrants into citizens? So there are several solutions that have been proposed, starting from wearables, through access to libraries, through monitoring facilities, access to databases, applications allowing migrants to get information about who and how, and so avoid falling into new networks of traffickers, etc. So if you only wish, we could discuss it in great detail. But I also want to talk about the premise and some issues that we have to be aware of it. So yesterday, when we talk about technology, one of the arguments was that, well, maybe technology is not such a good thing. I'm a fervent supporter of technology, but whenever we do that, we always have to remember that we have to be very sensitive to social and ethical considerations. And then there's also the legal dimension that follows. So there are very serious issues of privacy, breaches to privacy. There is also the very thin line of how much of surveillance and monitoring and privacy again. So there are those spheres that we need to address if we want to really exploit the promise of ICT in context of smart city or in context of city and migration. So what are the takeaways? Cities are definitely the key actors in the process of managing migration, and their role is bound to increase in that process. Cities are engaged with the macro and micro, that is agency-related, day-to-day management of migration, and no one can deny that. And yet, there isn't enough of consideration given to the role cities play in that process. So considering issues of scarcity in city space, including, again, space, funding, and other resources, planning is necessary. So the connection in this context between the receiving and incoming population has to be taken very seriously. The several cases from Europe suggest that because of lack consideration of, being given to this issue, results or basically fuels populism, etc., etc. ICT is number 4, and so the focus on the promise of smart city bears great advantage and great potential, and it ought to be discussed. And therefore, number 5, relevant policy making is mandatory. That is considering the very existence of ICT and considering also both the promise and the challenges that it may create. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for 10 minutes. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je laisserai maintenant la parole à M. John J. Bongat, maire de Naga aux Philippines.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, and to all of you, good morning. I'd like to congratulate all of you for staying up to this time. You are actually the last men and women sitting in this hall, so congratulations. So I've been invited here to talk about the Philippine experience, particularly the role of our city, the city government of Naga, in mainstreaming migration and development in its local development planning and budgeting. And we all know that well known is the phenomenon called migration, mobility, refugees, and many countries are talking about how to deal with these issues in migration in their respective countries to be able to protect the rights of migrants in their countries, but not in the case of the Philippines, because we are one of the countries in the world that sends the most number of its nationals abroad. To be very specific, at least 10% of the Philippine population of 106 million in 2018 are overseas Filipino workers or Filipinos residing abroad and earning a living and sending remittances to the tune of 33 billion US dollars in 2018, which represents roughly 10.5% of the more than 300 billion US dollars in gross domestic product of the country. So much is being done actually by the country at the national level. Since many decades ago, the establishment of national agencies like the POEA, the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration, the Overseas Welfare Workers Welfare Authority, and so the Commission on Filipinos Overseas. There are lots of agencies at the national level, but local governments don't seem to dip its finger in issues affecting overseas Filipinos and overseas Filipino workers. Not in the case of Naga, when in 2010, through an EU-funded project, we were able to realize that there's a need for local governments to be on board insofar as, dealing with issues affecting overseas Filipinos and their families left behind, the abuses that they face abroad from employers, and so on and so forth. So that was the first time that a local government in the country ever participated on the issue of Filipino migrants abroad, so that they will be able to protect their rights. So it was a wake-up call for the city to really do something about this particular matter. So what we did was to mainstream migration in local development planning, and this is what we did. We raised awareness of the people insofar as the role of the local government is concerned on migration and the development of capacity of the local government to deal with these issues. So I'm going to present just maybe a few slides regarding migration and development matters. We have a very limited time, so I'll not discuss many of these. But these are the initiatives undertaken at the local level, which is very pioneering in our country. And if I may, I will present to you this particular video, but it's...
The case, Naga City. Naga City is located in the Bicol region, which is one of the most important sending regions of overseas Filipinos, with Naga City itself sending the highest number of overseas Filipinos within the region. Moreover, 11% of the city's total number of households are reliant on remittances, pensions, and retirements as sources of income. Increasing emigration and dependence on remittances can be attributed to Bicol's susceptibility to natural hazards, such as earthquakes,
I don't know. Maybe there's no more time. Yeah. I don't know what happened to the video. So I think that's it for my presentation. So just think of the rest of the video, and we'll just interact with you later.
Thank you very much. I'll now invite Madam Ms. Debbie Douglas to address us.
Is my microphone on? Thank you. Good morning. I want to echo Mayor Bongat in thanking you for staying on a Friday morning and the last day of Metropolis. I would like to begin by acknowledging the privilege to speak here on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. It is a pleasure to have the opportunity to do so here at International Metropolis. If my presentation had a name, it probably would be called The Increasing Difficulties of Inclusion and Integration. So just bear with me while I throw some stats at you at the top of my presentation. On June 16th, 2019, we read in the media that a majority of Canadians polled, approximately 63%, believe the federal government should limit the number of immigrants to the country. The poll was conducted by Leisure between June 7th and 10th. Only 37% of those polled thought that there should be more immigration to meet Canada's economic needs. The respondents were randomly recruited, that's my caveat, so they're probably not a representative random sample of the population, but still the findings are worrying. An earlier poll by the same company in February of this year found that half the respondents believed that Canada welcomes too many immigrants and refugees. But what we found most alarming was the expressed preference for white immigration. An ECOS poll from April found that around 42% of Canadians believe too many non-white people were accepted as immigrants into Canada. Another poll last month had a similar finding, with 37% of those polled saying that they believe non-white immigration was a threat to Canada. Many of us and many Canadians across the country, from coast to coast to coast, believe that if these findings were from the US or Europe, folks wouldn't be too surprised, but not Canada. However, racism, and in particular anti-Black racism and Islamophobia, because as we know, Muslims are often constructed as racialized, is alive and well here in the Great North. So the findings of the poll should not be a surprise to us, nor should it be seen as some new Canadian attitude. What was new, as the pollster reported, is that for the first time since it began its tracking in the 1990s, resentment about the growth of immigration was now blended with resentment about the rate of non-white immigration. What is also important to note is that the majority of those holding these views were also partial to the conservative movement. And as I said, up to 70% of those who believe that non-white immigration was a threat to Canada and that Canada was accepting too many non-white immigrants identified as supporters of Canada's federal Conservative Party. These hardening attitudes are deeply troubling on many levels, not the least that we are heading into a federal election in a couple of months. A couple of weeks ago, after a marathon debate on Sunday, June 16th, the Quebec government pushed through Bill 21, the so-called secularism law. The law bars service employees such as teachers, police officers, judges, and others from wearing religious symbols such as crucifixes, kippas, turbans, hijabs, and niqabs in the course of their duties. The bill took a harder line on a previous government measure by a previous Liberal government in Quebec that residents are required to uncover their faces when accessing public services such as public transit and the legal system. And along with Bill 21, the Quebec government announced it will establish surveillance and disciplinary mechanisms to ensure the bill is respected. The bill and the enforcement measures have been met with massive public outcry, and different groups continue to protest both. I must say that among the most outspoken protesters are Muslim women, particularly Muslim women of color, who are hijabis. And if there was ever any question about whether or not they were socially integrated into Quebec and Canadian society, their active participation in organizing and speaking out against the bill should convince anyone otherwise. Through their actions, they have demonstrated that they are aware, engaged, and will not hesitate to speak out against injustice and for their human rights. The Quebec government's version of social integration is one of forced secularism, one that comes complete with enforcement mechanisms. It is also one of religious and racial intolerance, since Muslim women are disproportionately affected and they are also predominantly women of color. I often say that Islamophobia is fought on the bodies of Muslim women. Groups like Justice Femme are bearing witness. They are documenting and reporting out the increase that they are seeing in the experiences of violence against Muslim women and Muslim women who are visibly Muslim. It was really sad then that when the Premier of Quebec, in an interview a couple of days ago, were asked to comment on the fact that Bill 21 was resulting in these increased Islamophobic attacks, he said that he did not really believe that that was happening. It was only 2.5 years ago that Quebec Muslims were subjected to a terror attack, a mass shooting at the Quebec City Mosque that left 6 worshippers killed and 19 others injured. There are connections here. But moving on from Quebec. Canada generally prides itself on acknowledging that integration is a two-way process where individuals and groups can be full participants in Canadian society while retaining their own cultural identity, unlike, say, the United States, which uses language of assimilation. The Immigration and Refugee Protection Act states as its objective, and I quote, to promote the successful integration of permanent residents into Canada while recognizing that integration involves mutual obligations for new immigrants and Canadian society, end of quote. To facilitate the process, the federal government and some subnational governments, as certainly here in Ontario, invest significantly, especially at the federal level, in settlement services, including free language trainings to support new arrivals, or at the least the sanctioned ones, those we invite in to settle and integrate. The support is helped along by rules that mandate fluency in one of the 2 official languages in order to gain residency or citizenship, the steel in the velvet glove, as we say at Okasi. Yes, integration is a two-way process, but done our way. The Department of Canadian Heritage, which is tasked with the implementation of the Multiculturalism Act, sees its role as promoting and celebrating an inclusive society. And yesterday we celebrated Multicultural Day here in Canada. But as those using a critical analysis have pointed out, Canada's discourse on immigration and multiculturalism is one of compliance and conformity. That ultimately it is an exhortation to become more like us without quite defining the us. And in case I'm not being clear on where I stand, this exhortation to become more like us are neither possible, as my people who've been here for 7 generations will tell you, nor even desirable. Witness the invoking of Canadian culture and Canadian values, whatever that might be, by certain media organizations and certain politicians from time to time over the last several decades, or even over the last couple of days. It's used to demonize people of color, to express thinly veiled racism, xenophobia, and Islamophobia. Just this morning, I was reading, as you will know, the Federal Department of Canadian Heritage released its long-awaited anti-racism strategy a couple of days ago. And the immediate response from one of our national party leaders is dog whistling around Islam and Muslims. This leader talked about, okay, they tried to push through Motion 103, and for those of you not from Canada, Motion 103 was a non-binding, feel-good statement that basically says Canada is against Islamophobia and other forms of hate. That was seeking unanimous consent in our parliament. And this national leader says, first they gave us M103, and now comes the strategy. Are you concerned about Sharia? How that leap is made, this is what dog whistling is about. If social integration is intended to leave everyone with a sense of belonging and a full participant in society, we can clearly see that it is not playing out so well, even over several generations. We know that economic integration is a critical factor in achieving social integration. The United Way of Greater Toronto reflected in a recent report, Rebalancing the Opportunity Equation, that and I quote, our social foundations are weakened when the opportunity equation is compromised. The report examined census data for the City of Toronto and spoke of the widening and deepening of income inequality along racial and gender lines, confirming what many of us have been talking about for the last 2 decades and more, that the intersections of racial and ethnic identity and gender are more likely to determine opportunity rather than the attainment of education, skills, or credentials. So I sometimes ask, as I do this work, is the idea of social integration even attainable? And I would like to think, yes, it is. Various municipal governments in Canada have also been asking that question and asking, how is it? What role do we have to play as municipal governments? What relationships do we have to develop with civil society organizations? How do we bring the other levels of government to the table? Cities can certainly look at themselves as corporations and put into place, as some have done, measures like employment equity and privilege those who have historically been excluded when they hire. They can give priorities to those who are most disadvantaged in their particular jurisdiction. They can explore using mechanisms such as paid internships and mentorships of immigrants, contract compliance with their vendors so that they're only contracting with vendors whose workforce resembles the city and the sites where they're located. One good example of this in Toronto is the Toronto Community Benefits Network, who is working very closely with city government as well as with labor to ensure that as the city invests billions of dollars in infrastructure, that apprenticeships and management positions and training is made available for racialized and indigenous young people in our communities and for women, so that women themselves are becoming involved in non-traditional trades, and that includes racialized immigrant and refugee women. There are also other opportunities where we've seen cities be proactively engaged in facilitating social, economic, and political integration. For example, we saw the City of Toronto take the lead in adopting a motion to allow immigrants, permanent residents specifically, to be able to participate in municipal elections, something that is already done in many places around the world. Thus, as I said, the City of Toronto was the first municipality in Canada to pass that motion, and in Ontario, it was quickly followed by North Bay, which is one of our small northern cities, and the City of Hamilton. And across Canada, Vancouver on our west coast and Calgary in the prairies also adopted the motion, and I know I'm quickly running out of time. Civil society organizations like OCASI and our member agencies have engaged with other municipalities where possible to encourage the adoption of a similar motion. A promising movement emerged a few years ago, but unfortunately seemed to have lost momentum. Let me jump to my conclusion with my last 90 seconds, and then I'm going to take an extra minute to show you something. That along with these very concrete, hard, put people to work, pay attention to policies and practices at the municipal level, I think cities also have a role to play in public education. And we have worked closely with the City of Toronto, and for my colleagues here who are members of OCASI, it's not that I don't think other cities in the province are not doing anything, but the council is located in the City of Toronto, and we tend to have more interaction with the city. But we've worked very closely with the City of Toronto on issues like access without fear, where municipal services are made accessible to everyone regardless of immigration status. But we've also worked closely with the city on developing public awareness campaign. Our two campaigns that we did with the city in the last couple of years have been focused on anti-Islamophobia, where we did a bus shelter campaign across the city and had pictures of two people, a Muslim woman in a hijab, a white person, and it says, as immigrants often hear, go back to where you come from, and the woman says, where? North York, which is a city, which is a small area in Toronto. We did a number of ads across the province where we had billboards on Highway 401 that talked about what do you call a Muslim woman flying an airplane? And what do you think the answer is? What do you call a Muslim woman flying an airplane? Progress. Thank you. So, and it sparked conversation. But I think what got the most play and what was incredibly important for us were two ads that we did. And this is really good example of public-private CSO, civil society organization partnership, where we worked pro bono with a communications firm along with the City of Toronto to develop these two ads that I want to leave you with. Please cue the USB.
There you are.
Islamophobia is on the rise in Ontario. You can help. Learn how at breakthebehavior.ca.
What? E.T. got the point and went home. Do another one.
Okay, this one's a good one. What do you call a Muslim flying a plane?
A pilot.
Thank you.
Racism stops when we break the behavior. Go to breakthebehavior.ca to sign the pledge.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maintenant, Madame Colleen Touez de la Open Society Foundations.
Allô? Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Maire, distinguished panelists, hosts, colleagues and friends. Bonjour. C'est un plaisir de vous retrouver ici, dans mon pays natal, que je ne vois pas aussi souvent que je le souhaiterais, mais qui m'interpelle fréquemment dans mon travail, car, et malgré peut-être les remarques que nous venons d'entendre, le Canada reste toujours un lieu de promesses et d'ouverture à la migration et à l'inclusion. Oui, je peux le dire parce que je travaille dans un contexte international qui est quand même de plus en plus effrayant. Good morning. It is a pleasure to be with you here at this International Metropolis Conference entitled The Promise of Migration, Inclusion, Economic Growth, and Global Cooperation. While my presentation touches on all three of these aspects, I will focus on the third, namely global cooperation. My remarks will center on the rising agency of cities in international diplomacy, specifically with respect to migration and refugee policy. In so doing, I will describe to you the work of the newly created initiative entitled the Mayor's Migration Council. Slide, please. The Mayor's Migration Council is a new initiative to help cities in their efforts to influence international discourse and priorities, and to create better outcomes for communities, migrants, and refugees. The MMC was launched in Marrakesh last December on the sidelines of the adoption of the Global Compact on Migration, or the GCM. But the MMC's creation has followed years of work connecting cities and the global stage, with the annual convening of the Mayoral Forum on Migration and Development dating back to 2014, which has since been adjoined to the Global Forum on Migration and Development, or the GFMD. In addition to such global gatherings where cities have become more prominent in their presence and in their participation, cities are also gaining influence. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Paris Agreement on Climate, the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction, the new Urban Agenda, all of these speak to the important role of cities in addressing global governance challenges. Most recently, cities have contributed in an instrumental fashion, both to the GCM and to the GCR, the Global Compact on Refugees, in ensuring that local priorities are reflected within them. And an untold story, which I will share with you today, since it was just mentioned by my colleague here, Debbie Douglas, is the fundamental role that cities play in ensuring non-discriminatory access to public services for all migrants. And there are references in the GCM under Objective 15 on public education and on public health, non-discriminatory access to public health, non-discriminatory access to public education. Those references are in there because of the advocacy work that cities did in ensuring that those norms found their way into that international agreement. So it is against this backdrop of the growing activism of cities and mayors on migration that the MMC was created, born out of a need to empower and enable cities with the knowledge, the connections, and the technical assistance to engage in migration diplomacy and policymaking on a regional and an international level. As we have seen with the so-called C40, or the network of cities committed to addressing climate change, the world's mayors can collaborate across geographies and party lines, they can share resources and knowledge, and they can collectively advocate for policy change on an international level. Indeed, with the support of the C40, cities are considered key implementing partners in the Paris Agreement. In a similar vein, the MMC seeks to strengthen the capacity of cities to engage internationally by providing them with the necessary knowledge and connections, by opening doors for cities to international policy discussions on migration and refugee protection, and by making city voices heard in these fora. It also supports cities' collective action and works to access resources such as funding and technical assistance for cities. A current example is the MMC's work in securing the role of cities in the follow-up and review process of the GCM, so that cities are recognized as key actors in the implementation of the compact. Ambassador Gomez Camacho of Mexico just a few moments ago spoke about the implementation now of the GCM, and you may have noticed that his first champions in the implementation of this international agreement, he stated mayors will implement the Global Compact on Migration. Why cities and why now? We've heard from a few of the panelists, and undoubtedly you've spoken about this over the last couple of days. Cities are appropriate and powerful partners in this work on migration and refugee issues because they are democratically elected, they are representative and held accountable, often on different time schedules than other levels of government. They are close on the ground, understanding and coming up with innovations to how to address some of the most pressing migrant and refugee challenges. They are often, or on the whole, not all, progressive and inclusive with respect to integration and inclusion. And many mayors in particular have positioned themselves in positions of influence to advocate publicly, whether it's at the local, national, or even international level. Cities are implementers in carrying out welcoming and integration. As we know, cities are at the center of global mobility. To quote a fellow Canadian, Douglas Saunders, in his book, The Largest Migration in Human History, cities are where migrants, international, and refugees are arriving. They are the front lines of welcoming refugees and migrants. They are increasingly engaged internationally. Mayor Valérie Plante of Montreal being one example, who delivered at the GCM conference last December the fruits of a declaration by cities known as the Marrakesh Cities Declaration, in which cities commit to implementing in unison, and I say that with emphasis, in unison, the obligations or the commitments rather of states in the GCM and in the GCR. And finally, the international system is signaling an opening to cities' involvement. Indeed, as cities mobilize, there are political opportunities at the international and at the interstate level that are opening up. As recently as a few weeks ago, an international group of cities advocated in a negotiation in the context of the General Assembly resolution on the follow-up and review of the GCM, negotiated for the place of cities successfully, I may add, tentatively successfully, for a key role, an important role, and a separate role from civil society as locally elected officials in their responsibilities and their commitment to implementing the GCM. Moreover, cities are in direct contact more frequently now with international organizations that provide relief and technical assistance, and more cities are also in discussions with international financial institutions for funding their development work. These political openings, matched with the rising agency of cities, has reinforced a need for the Mayor's Migration Council, which is working to ensure participation with a purpose for cities in interstate processes. But what I mean by purpose is that the end result is not the participation itself, but it is having cities unlock the resources that they require, material or otherwise, to start to achieve their objectives on the ground. An example here, you might imagine, for those of you who are not in Marrakesh, was the mayor of Kampala, Uganda, who at the 5th Mayoral Forum last December queried in a very public fashion the High Commissioner for Refugees, Mr. Filippo Grandi, on the need to match resources with accurate data on displacement figures in his city, encouraging a new generation of partnership between the city, this capital city of Kampala, and UNHCR. So what does the Mayor's Migration Council do? Its primary value add is to help cities navigate a complex landscape and the intricacies of the multilateral process, and to channel cities' advocacy and diplomacy efforts to secure both the representation and effective influence in international policy deliberations and decision-making in this field. It does so by providing technical assistance to city leadership to develop strategies and build coalitions at the request of cities. It does so by facilitating connections between cities and the multilateral system, as I just alluded to, and between cities, often leveraging existing intercity networks. It bridges and draws lessons across multilateral processes, highlighting and encouraging mainstreaming of migration and refugee concerns into other policy debates and agenda. It supports engagement of cities by assisting them in the development, dissemination, amplification of advocacy materials, such as public statements, editorials, and social media campaigns that help to support countering negative narratives about migration. And finally, it creates tools, commissioning new research, and providing a repository of information and resources that can inform policy-making decisions and deliberations. Who is involved? The MMC's distinguishing feature is its ability to nimbly respond to cities' requests and to seek out and support cities' efforts to take on challenges and opportunities within the international system. It does so with a small team of experts who span the range of expertise of international diplomacy and city governance. It is supported by the government of Switzerland, the Open Society Foundations, and it is implemented in partnership with the C40. And fundamentally, the Mayor's Migration Council is guided by a strong founding group of extraordinary mayors from 11 cities from around the world who have personally committed to delivering on its mission. These are the mayors of Amman, Athens, Bristol, Freetown, Kampala, Los Angeles, Milan, Montreal, Quezon City, Sao Paulo, and Zurich. In closing, we are at the early stages of a groundswell where mayors' activism and cities' activism is on the rise. Cities are mobilizing and forging ahead on the most pressing challenges of our time, and migration being at the top, as we heard from the mayor of Gatineau. Cities' perspectives are invaluable in crafting international policy on migration in a way that reflects realities on the ground and that shapes norm setting of the future. Cities will no doubt continue to play a central role in moving progress forward on tackling migration challenges despite increasingly difficult national contexts, political, financial, and otherwise, which is the case in many of the places where they operate. The MMC, in partnership with cities and city networks around the world, will support efforts to engage up, to inform and influence national and international policy deliberations on migration. Indeed, it is worth emphasizing that the question of cities' inclusion in interstate policy deliberations has, for the last decade, really been about why they should be at the table. But today, it is no longer about why they are important, rather how cities can participate and be treated as full partners in migration governance. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Maintenant, ce sera Madame Dr Gioconda Herrera qui va nous adresser la parole. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour. I'm really delighted to be here. Thanks very much to the organizer for giving me the opportunity to share with you some of my reflections. The title of my presentation is Latin American Cities, New Migration Patterns and the Challenge of Social Inclusion. And I would like to focus on the current exodus of Venezuelan people all over South America. A few years ago, Sabrina started walking around the La Mariscal neighborhood in Quito every day, taking care of the cars of office workers, public employees, shop customers, and many more people who come to work in this part of the city. She came to Ecuador in 2012 from Port-au-Prince, and while bureaucrats in suits and high heels ran to their workplaces late, Sabrina, together with other Asian women, roamed the streets, imagining future places and homes, perhaps farther south in Brazil or to the north in Miami, where several of their relatives already live. Sabrina's job, keeping watch over parked cars, is one of the many activities she undertakes on the street, alongside street vendors offering food, clothing, and more as part of the multiple occupations held by workers in the city's informal economy. Side by side with peasant indigenous women from elsewhere in Ecuador who come to the city to sell fruits and vegetables on street corners, Sabrina and many more immigrants from Haiti, Colombia, Peru, Cuba, and now more and more Venezuela, but also the Middle East, occupy the streets of Quito day after day trying to make a living. In the last 20 years, along with South-North migration, more and more migrants from other regions of Latin America and the Global South are coming to places without a tradition of international migration, such as cities like Quito, Bogota, or Lima. At a much more uneven and slow rhythm than the monetary, material, and information flows circulating globally, intra-regional and transcontinental migrants are changing the face of cities as internal migrants did in the 1950s, 60s, or 70s throughout Latin America. These new migrants contribute to local economies little by little, generally with precarious work, braving risks and uncertainty. Moonlighting, or what were designated as survival strategies in the early 1970s, tend to characterize these migrations because their insertion into the labor market occurs mostly in informal spaces and social integration is very fragile. In this presentation, I examine the nature of this new migration and focuses on the more recent flow of Venezuelan migrants to Ecuador and to the city of Quito in particular. I seek to explore how are these movements different from other cross-border south-north flows that have been previously prevalent in the region. What does this new flows tell us about the change in migration dynamics in the region? and what kind of challenges do they present in terms of social inclusion. So let me go briefly to the first point. On the one hand, the economic downturn experienced in South America, including Ecuador, has produced the increased informalization of labor markets, as well as segregation of race and gender. In the case of Ecuador, the informal economy extends to more than 50% of the economically active population, and migrants therefore generally share the occupations of the native population. Moreover, in cities with little international migration traditions, such as Quito, the lives of these immigrants are intertwined with the experiences of other informal workers in the city, blurring the boundaries between migrant and locals in how they related to the labor market. This raises questions about how migrants are navigating this labor market and about whether or not these conditions influence their decision to seek or not a more permanent settlement. On the other hand, the tightening of immigration policies in northern countries, accentuated both in Europe and the United States, has in a way expanded the border to the south, creating a domino effect on the migration policies of governments such as Mexico or certain states in Central America, and even South America, such as Brazil, Argentina, or Chile, which have also tightened their immigration policies, increasing the vulnerability of these migrant populations when they cross these territories. In addition to material conditions, cultural representations may vary. In contrast to south-north migrations, and in south-south migrations, they may construct different representations of receiving societies, and as we shall see in the cases of Venezuelan, there is a very dynamic way of negotiating the relationship with the other from part of migrants. Let me now go to what are some of the national policies in Ecuador in order to integrate what are the main challenges for cities and for local integration. Ecuador has a very grant many rights with his constitution to migration to migrants. One of the most important one is the free movement of people and progressive extensions of the status of foreigner and the full respect to the rights of immigrants in its territory, and the elimination of visa requirements for every nation in June 2008. But such policy did not last long for many reasons that I will not enter right now, and more we are having a restrictive policies of different kinds. This is the context in which migration from Venezuela started coming, particularly in the last 3 years. We know that we are going through a humanitarian migration crisis from this country. Currently, Venezuelans are going all over South America, being Colombia and Peru, the most important countries where Venezuelans are getting, but also Ecuador and Chile are important receiving countries for Venezuelan citizens. The Venezuelans in Ecuador are currently around 240,000 people, which implies many challenges for local policies as well as national policies. There is a quick transformation of the kind of migrants that are coming. At the very beginning, there were more qualified migration professionals, and it's getting more and more diverse. And we have particularly young families and small children. The presence of children and women is particularly important and relevant and vulnerable. The Ecuadorian migration toward Venezuela are changing very quickly. We have had several ways of welcoming Venezuelan people, but more and more regulations are causing restrictions and problems for Venezuelan citizens in the country. What we have is that social and economic conditions have worsened, particularly from the last year, and the acute economic crisis in Ecuador, together with increasing xenophobia and more problems for them of regularizing their situation, are producing much more vulnerability for this population. In spite of this open migration policy at the national level and discourse, we had a lot of regulations that in fact are producing irregularities, such as high penalties for overstaying and other measures that tend to deter migrants to apply for work permits, for example. Also, we have detected labor exploitation, and that irregularity may produce labor and sexual trafficking as well, and that increased border control may stimulate more human smuggling activities rather than controlling them. And above all, we know that migration for Venezuela will continue. Lastly, what we are currently saying is a more and more mobile population. Venezuela are not settling down in the city. They are moving around cities within Ecuador. They are moving around cities within the South America. So this idea of continuous mobility is one of the most important challenges for social inclusions within cities. And finally, I think that there has been urgent humanitarian responses, but we have to shift to more development and social policies responses in that case. Just to conclude, there is an increasing use of humanitarian tropes in migration control and in the externalization of borders, and the regularization of migrants through tighter visa policies and regulations is an example of these trends, not only in the north, but also in countries of the south. Immigration policies grounded on arguments around migrant selectivity rather than universality are somewhat taking place. I think the focus on crisis, emergency, and exception tend to naturalize migration as a problem, and migrants as always already suspicious, both as victims of trafficking or potential transgressors. I would say that instead of talking about migration crisis, we may rather talk about migration in times of crisis, in times of economic crisis. We should take into account that structural socioeconomic conditions as well as problems in regularization tend to deter instead of including migrants to receiving societies, and that the racialization of mobile bodies, selectivities, and degrees of worthiness of protection and intervention. Finally, challenges for social inclusions in times of economic crisis have to be taken into account in order to avoid the progressive increase of xenophobia in our own societies. Thank you.